Moby Dick, by Herman Melville. Chapter 128. The Pequod Meets the Rachel. Next day a large ship, the Rachel, was descried, bearing directly down upon the Pequod, all her spars thickly clustering with men. At the time the Pequod was making good speed through the water; but as the broad‐winged windward stranger shot nigh to her, the boastful sails all fell together as blank bladders that are burst, and all life fled from the smitten hull. "Bad news, she brings bad news," muttered the old Manxman; but ere her commander, who with trumpet to mouth stood up in his boat, ere he could hopefully hail, Ahab's voice was heard. "Hast seen the White Whale?" "Aye, yesterday. Have ye seen a whale boat adrift?" Throttling his joy, Ahab negatively answered this unexpected question, and would have fain boarded the stranger, when the stranger captain himself, having stopped his vessel's way, was seen descending her side. A few keen pulls, and his boat hook soon clinched the Pequod's main chains, and he sprang to the deck. Immediately he was recognized by Ahab for a Nantucketer he knew, but no formal salutation was exchanged. "Where was he? Not killed? Not killed?" cried Ahab, closely advancing. "How was it?" It seemed that somewhere late in the afternoon of the day previous, while three of the stranger's boats were engaged with a shoal of whales, which had led them some 4 or 5 miles from the ship, and while they were yet in swift chase to windward, the white hump and head of Moby Dick had suddenly loomed up out of the water, not very far to leeward; whereupon the fourth rigged boat, a reserved one, had been instantly lowered in chase. After a keen sail before the wind, this fourth boat, the swiftest keeled of all, seemed to have succeeded in fastening, at least as well as the man at the mast‐head could tell anything about it. In the distance he saw the diminished dotted boat, and then a swift gleam of bubbling white water, and after that nothing more, whence it was concluded that the stricken whale must have indefinitely run away with his pursuers, as often happens. There was some apprehension, but no positive alarm as yet. The recall signals were placed in the riggings, darkness came on, and forced to pick up her 3 far to windward boats, ere going in quest of the fourth one in the precisely opposite direction, the ship had not only been necessitated to leave that boat to its fate till near midnight, but for the time to increase her distance from it. But the rest of her crew being at last safe aboard, she crowded all sail, stunsail on stunsail, after the missing boat, kindling a fire in her trypots for a beacon, and every other man aloft on the look out. But though when she had thus sailed a sufficient distance to gain the presumed place of the absent ones when last seen; though she then paused to lower her spare boats to pull all around her, and not finding anything, had again dashed on, again paused and lowered her boats; and though she had thus continued doing till daylight, yet not the least glimpse of the missing keel had been seen. The story told, the stranger captain immediately went on to reveal his object in boarding the Pequod. He desired that ship to unite with his own in the search, by sailing over the sea some 4 or 5 miles apart on parallel lines, and so sweeping a double horizon as it were. "I will wager something now," whispered Stubb to Flask, "that some one in that missing boat wore off that captain's best coat. Mayhap his watch; he's so cursed anxious to get it back. Who ever heard of 2 pious whale ships cruising after one missing whale boat in the height of the whaling season? See, Flask, only see how pale he looks; pale in the very buttons of his eyes. Look, it wasn't the coat; it must have been my boy. My own boy is among them. For God's sake, I beg, I conjure," here exclaimed the stranger captain to Ahab, who thus far had but icily received his petition, "for 48 hours let me charter your ship. I will gladly pay for it, and roundly pay for it, if there be no other way. For 48 hours only, only that, you must, oh you must, and you shall do this thing." "His son!" cried Stubb. "Oh, it's his son he's lost. I take back the coat and the watch. What says Ahab? We must save that boy." "He's drowned with the rest of 'em last night," said the old Manx sailor standing behind them. "I heard. All of ye heard their spirits." Now, as it shortly turned out, what made this incident of the Rachel's the more melancholy, was the circumstance that not only was one of the captain's sons among the number of the missing boat's crew, but among the number of the other boat's crews, and at the same time, but on the other hand, separated from the ship during the dark vicissitudes of the chase, there had been still another son, and that for a time the wretched father was plunged to the bottom of the cruellest perplexity, which was only solved for him by his chief mate's instinctively adopting the ordinary procedure of a whale ship in such emergencies; that is, when placed between jeopardized but divided boats, always to pick up the majority first. But the captain, for some unknown constitutional reason, had refrained from mentioning all this, and not till forced to it by Ahab's iciness, did he allude to his one yet missing boy, a little lad but 12 years old, whose father, with the earnest but unmisgiving hardihood of a Nantucketer's paternal love, had thus early sought to initiate him in the perils and wonders of a vocation almost immemorially the destiny of all his race. Nor does it unfrequently occur that Nantucket captains will send a son of such tender age away from them, for a protracted 3 or 4 years' voyage in some other ship than their own, so that their first knowledge of a whaleman's career shall be unenervated by any chance display of a father's natural but untimely partiality, or undue apprehensiveness and concern. Meantime, now the stranger was still beseeching his poor boon of Ahab, and Ahab still stood like an anvil, receiving every shock, but without the least quivering of his own. "I will not go," said the stranger, "till you say aye to me. Do me as you would have me do to you in the like case; for you too have a boy, Captain Ahab, though but a child, and nestling safely at home now; a child of your old age too. Yes, yes, you relent. I see it. Run, run, men, now, and stand by to square in the yards." "Avast!" cried Ahab. "Touch not a rope yarn." Then in a voice that prolongingly moulded every word, "Captain Gardner, I will not do it. Even now I lose time. Good bye, good bye. God bless ye, man, and may I forgive myself, but I must go. Mr. Starbuck, look at the binnacle watch, and in 3 minutes from this present instant warn off all strangers. Then brace forward again, and let the ship sail as before." Hurriedly turning, with averted face, he descended into his cabin, leaving the strange captain transfixed at this unconditional and utter rejection of his so earnest suit. But starting from his enchantment, Gardner silently hurried to the side, more fell than stepped into his boat, and returned to his ship. Soon the two ships diverged their wakes, and long as the strange vessel was in view, she was seen to yaw hither and thither at every dark spot, however small on the sea. This way and that her yards were swung round; starboard and larboard she continued to tack. Now she beat against a head sea, and again it pushed her before it, while all the while her masts and yards were thickly clustered with men, as 3 tall cherry trees when the boys are cherrying among the boughs. But by her still halting course, and winding woeful way, you plainly saw that this ship that so wept with spray, still remained without comfort. She was Rachel, weeping for her children, because they were not. Chapter 129. The Cabin. Ahab moving to go on deck. Pip catches him by the hand to follow. "Lad, lad, I tell thee, thou must not follow Ahab now. The hour is coming when Ahab would not scare thee from him, yet would not have thee by him. There is that in thee, poor lad, which I feel too curing to my malady. Like cures like, and for this hunt my malady becomes my most desired health. Do thou abide below here, where they shall serve thee as if thou wert the captain. Aye, lad, thou shalt sit here in my own screwed chair. Another screw to it thou must be.
No, no, no. Ye have not a whole body, sir. Do ye but use poor me for your one lost leg. Only tread upon me, sir. I ask no more, so I remain a part of ye.
Oh, spite of million villains, this makes me a bigot in the fadeless fidelity of man, and a black, and crazy. But methinks like cures like applies to him too. He grows so sane again.
They tell me, sir, that Stubb did once desert poor little Pip, whose drowned bones now show white for all the blackness of his living skin. But I will never desert ye, sir, as Stubb did him. Sir, I must go with ye.
If thou speakest thus to me much more, Ahab's purpose keels up in him. I tell thee no, it cannot be.
Oh, good master, master, master!
Weep so, and I will murder thee. Have a care, for Ahab too is mad. Listen, and thou wilt often hear my ivory foot upon the deck, and still know that I am there. And now I quit thee. Thy hand met. True art thou, lad, as the circumference to its centre. So God for ever bless thee, and if it come to that, God for ever save thee, let what will befall.
Ahab goes. Pip steps one step forward. Here he this instant stood. I stand in his air, but I'm alone. Now were even poor Pip here I could endure it, but he's missing. Pip, Pip, ding dong ding, who's seen Pip? He must be up here. Let's try the door. What? Neither lock, nor bolt, nor bar, and yet there's no opening it. It must be the spell. He told me to stay here, aye, and told me this screwed chair was mine. Here then, I'll seat me against the transom, in the ship's full middle, all her keel and her three masts before me. Here our old sailors say, in their black 74s great admirals sometimes sit at table and lord it over rows of captains and lieutenants. Huh! What's this? Epaulets! Epaulets! The epaulets all come crowding. Pass round the decanters. Glad to see ye. Fill up, messieurs. What an odd feeling now, when a black boy's host to white men with gold lace upon their coats. Messieurs, have you seen one Pip? A little negro lad, 5 feet high, hang-dog look, and cowardly. Jumped from a whale-boat once. Seen him? No? Well then, fill up again, captains, and let's drink shame upon all cowards. I name no names. Shame upon them. Put one foot upon the table. Shame upon all cowards. Hist! Above there! I hear ivory. Oh, master, master, I am indeed downhearted when you walk over me. But here I'll stay, though this stern strikes rocks, and they bulge through, and oysters come to join me.
Chapter 130. The Hat. And now that at the proper time and place, after so long and wide a preliminary cruise, Ahab, all other whaling waters swept, seemed to have chased his foe into an ocean fold to slay him the more securely there; now that he found himself hard by the very latitude and longitude where his tormenting wound had been inflicted; now that a vessel had been spoken, which on the very day preceding had actually encountered Moby Dick; and now that all his successive meetings with various ships contrastingly concurred to show the demoniac indifference with which the white whale tore his hunters, whether sinning or sinned against; Now it was that there lurked a something in the old man's eyes which it was hardly sufferable for feeble souls to see. As the unsetting polar star, which through the livelong Arctic 6 months' night sustains its piercing steady central gaze, so Ahab's purpose now fixedly gleamed down upon the constant midnight of the gloomy crew. It domineered above them so, that all their bodings, doubts, misgivings, fears, were fain to hide beneath their souls, and not sprout forth a single spear or leaf. In this foreshadowing interval, too, all humor, forced or natural, vanished. Stubb no more strove to raise a smile. Starbuck no more strove to check one. Alike joy and sorrow, hope and fear, seemed ground to finest dust, and powdered for the time in the clamped mortar of Ahab's iron soul. Like machines, they dumbly moved about the deck, ever conscious that the old man's despot eye was on them. But did you deeply scan him in his more secret confidential hours, when he thought no glance but one was on him, then you would have seen that even as Ahab's eyes so awed the crew's, the inscrutable Parsee's glance awed his, or somehow at least in some wild way at times affected it. Such an added, gliding strangeness began to invest the thin Fedallah now, such ceaseless shuddering shook him, that the men looked dubious at him, half uncertain, as it seemed, whether indeed he were a mortal substance, or else a tremulous shadow cast upon the deck by some unseen being's body. And that shadow was always hovering there. For not by night even had Fedallah ever certainly been known to slumber, or go below. He would stand still for hours, but never sat or leaned. His wan but wondrous eyes did plainly say, we two watchmen never rest. Nor at any time, by night or day, could the mariners now step upon the deck, unless Ahab was before them, either standing in his pivot hole, or exactly pacing the planks between two undeviating limits, the mainmast and the mizzen; or else they saw him standing in the cabin scuttle, his living foot advanced upon the deck as if to step, his hat slouched heavily over his eyes; so that however motionless he stood, however the days and nights were added on that he had not swung in his hammock, yet hidden beneath that slouching hat, they could never tell unerringly whether, for all this, his eyes were really closed at times, or whether he was still intently scanning them. No matter though he stood so in the scuttle for a whole hour on the stretch, and the unheeded night damp gathered in beads of dew upon that stone-carved coat and hat. The clothes that night had wet, the next day's sunshine dried upon him. And so day after day, and night after night, he went no more beneath the planks. Whatever he wanted from the cabin, that thing he sent for. He ate in the same open air; that is, his two only meals, breakfast and dinner. Supper he never touched, nor reaped his beard, which darkly grew all gnarled, as unearthed roots of trees blown over, which still grow idly on at naked base, though perished in the upper verdure. But though his whole life was now become one watch on deck, and though the Parsee's mystic watch was without intermission as his own, yet these two never seemed to speak, one man to the other, unless at long intervals some passing, unmomentous matter made it necessary. Though such a potent spell seemed secretly to join the twain, openly, and to the awe-struck crew, they seemed pole-like asunder. If by day they chanced to speak one word, by night dumb men were both, so far as concerned the slightest verbal interchange. At times, for longest hours, without a single hail, they stood far parted in the starlight, Ahab in his scuttle, the Parsee by the mainmast, but still fixedly gazing upon each other, as if in the Parsee Ahab saw his forethrown shadow, in Ahab the Parsee his abandoned substance. And yet somehow did Ahab, in his own proper self, as daily, hourly, and every instant commandingly revealed to his subordinates, Ahab seemed an independent lord, the Parsee but his slave. Still again both seemed yoked together, and an unseen tyrant driving them, the lean shade siding the solid rib. For be this Parsee what he may, all rib and keel was solid Ahab. At the first faintest glimmering of the dawn, his iron voice was heard from aft, "Man the mast heads!" and all through the day, till after sunset and after twilight, the same voice every hour, at the striking of the helmsman's bell, was heard, "What d'ye see? Sharp! Sharp!" But when 3 or 4 days had slided by after meeting the children-seeking Rachel, and no spout had yet been seen, the monomaniac old man seemed distrustful of his crew's fidelity. At least of nearly all except the pagan harpooneers. He seemed to doubt, even, whether Stubb and Flask might not willingly overlook the sight he sought. But if these suspicions were really his, he sagaciously refrained from verbally expressing them, however his actions might seem to hint them. "I will have first sight of the whale myself," he said. "Aye, Ahab must have the doubloon." And with his own hands he rigged a nest of basketed bowlines, and sending a hand aloft with a single sheaved block to secure to the main mast head, he received the 2 ends of the downward reeved rope, and attaching one to his basket, prepared a pin for the other end, in order to fasten it at the rail. This done, with that end yet in his hand, and standing beside the pin, he looked round upon his crew, sweeping from one to the other, pausing his glance long upon Daggoo, Queequeg, Tashtego, but shunning Fedallah; and then settling his firm, relying eye upon the chief mate, said, "Take the rope, sir. I give it into thy hands, Starbuck." Then arranging his person in the basket, he gave the word for them to hoist him to his perch, Starbuck being the one who secured the rope at last, and afterwards stood near it. And thus, with one hand clinging round the royal mast, Ahab gazed abroad upon the sea for miles and miles; ahead, astern, this side and that, within the wide expanded circle commanded at so great a height. When, in working with his hands at some lofty, almost isolated place in the rigging, which chances to afford no foothold, the sailor at sea is hoisted up to that spot, and sustained there by the rope; under these circumstances, its fastened end on deck is always given in strict charge to some one man, who has the special watch of it. Because in such a wilderness of running rigging, whose various different relations aloft cannot always be infallibly discerned by what is seen of them at the deck, and when the deck ends of these ropes are being every few minutes cast down from the fastenings, it would be but a natural fatality, if, unprovided with a constant watchman, the hoisted sailor should by some carelessness of the crew be cast adrift, and fall all swooping to the sea. So Ahab's proceedings in this matter were not unusual. The only strange thing about them seemed to be, that Starbuck, almost the one only man who had ever ventured to oppose him with anything in the slightest degree approaching to decision; one of those, too, whose faithfulness on the look-out he had seemed to doubt somewhat; it was strange that this was the very man he should select for his watchman, freely giving his whole life into such an otherwise distrusted person's hands. Now the first time Ahab was perched aloft, ere he had been there 10 minutes, one of those red‐billed savage sea hawks which so often fly incommodiously close round the manned mastheads of whalemen in these latitudes, one of those birds came wheeling and screaming round his head in a maze of untrackably swift circlings. Then it darted 1,000 feet straight up into the air, then spiralized downwards, and went eddying again round his head. But with his gaze fixed upon the dim and distant horizon, Ahab seemed not to mark this wild bird; nor, indeed, would any one else have marked it much, it being no uncommon circumstance. Only now, almost the least heedful eye seemed to see some sort of cunning meaning in almost every sight. "Your hat! Your hat, sir!" suddenly cried the Sicilian seaman, who, being posted at the mizzen mast head, stood directly behind Ahab, though somewhat lower than his level, and with a deep gulf of air dividing them. But already the sable wing was before the old man's eyes, the long hooked bill at his head; with a scream the black hawk darted away with his prize. An eagle flew thrice round Tarquin's head, removing his cap to replace it; and thereupon Tanaquil, his wife, declared that Tarquin would be king of Rome. But only by the replacing of the cap was that omen accounted good. Ahab's hat was never restored. The wild hawk flew on and on with it, far in advance of the prow, and at last disappeared, while from the point of that disappearance a minute black spot was dimly discerned falling from that vast height into the sea. CHAPTER 131. The Pequod Meets the Delight. The intense Pequod sailed on; the rolling waves and days went by; the life buoy coffin still lightly swung; and another ship, most miserably misnamed the Delight, was descried. As she drew nigh, all eyes were fixed upon her broad beams, called sheers, which in some whaling ships cross the quarter deck at the height of 8 or 9 feet, serving to carry the spare, unrigged, or disabled boats. Upon the stranger's sheers were beheld the shattered white ribs and some few splintered planks of what had once been a whale boat; but you now saw through this wreck, as plainly as you see through the peeled, half unhinged, and bleaching skeleton of a horse. "Hast seen the white whale?" "Look!" replied the hollow cheeked captain from his taffrail, and with his trumpet he pointed to the wreck. "Hast killed him?" "The harpoon is not yet forged that will ever do that," answered the other, sadly glancing upon a rounded hammock on the deck, whose gathered sides some noiseless sailors were busy in sewing together. "Not forged!" and snatching Perth's levelled iron from the crotch, Ahab held it out, exclaiming, "Look ye, Nantucketer! Here in this hand I hold his death. Tempered in blood, and tempered by lightning are these barbs; and I swear to temper them triply in that hot place behind the fin, where the white whale most feels his accursed life." "Then God keep thee, old man. Seest thou that?" pointing to the hammock. "I bury but one of 5 stout men, who were alive only yesterday, but were dead ere night. Only that one I bury; the rest were buried before they died. You sail upon their tomb." Then turning to his crew, "Are ye ready there? Place the plank then on the rail, and lift the body. So then, O God!" advancing towards the hammock with uplifted hands, "may the resurrection and the life—" "Brace forward! Up helm!" cried Ahab like lightning to his men. But the suddenly started Pequod was not quick enough to escape the sound of the splash that the corpse soon made as it struck the sea; not so quick, indeed, but that some of the flying bubbles might have sprinkled her hull with their ghostly baptism. As Ahab now glided from the dejected Delight, the strange life buoy hanging at the Pequod's stern came into conspicuous relief. "Ha! Yonder! Look yonder, men!" cried a foreboding voice in her wake. "In vain, oh ye strangers, you fly our sad burial. Ye but turn us your taffrail to show us your coffin." CHAPTER 132. The Symphony. It was a clear, steel blue day. The firmaments of air and sea were hardly separable in that all-pervading azure. Only the pensive air was transparently pure and soft, with a woman's look, and the robust and man-like sea heaved with long, strong, lingering swells, as Samson's chest in his sleep. Hither and thither, on high, glided the snow-white wings of small unspeckled birds. These were the gentle thoughts of the feminine air; but to and fro in the deeps, far down in the bottomless blue, rushed mighty leviathans, sword fish, and sharks, and these were the strong, troubled, murderous thinkings of the masculine sea. But though thus contrasting within, the contrast was only in shades and shadows without. Those two seemed one. It was only the sex, as it were, that distinguished them. Aloft, like a royal czar and king, the sun seemed giving this gentle air to this bold and rolling sea, even as bride to groom. And at the girdling line of the horizon, a soft and tremulous motion, most seen here at the equator, denoted the fond, throbbing trust, the loving alarms with which the poor bride gave her bosom away. Tied up and twisted, gnarled and knotted with wrinkles, haggardly firm and unyielding, his eyes glowing like coals that still glow in the ashes of ruin, untottering Ahab stood forth in the clearness of the morn, lifting his splintered helmet of a brow to the fair girl's forehead of heaven. O immortal infancy and innocency of the azure! Invisible winged creatures that frolic all round us, sweet childhood of air and sky, how oblivious were ye of old Ahab's close–coiled woe! But so have I seen little Miriam and Martha, laughing–eyed elves, heedlessly gambol around their old sire, sporting with the circle of singed locks which grew on the marge of that burnt–out crater of his brain. Slowly crossing the deck from the scuttle, Ahab leaned over the side, and watched how his shadow in the water sank and sank to his gaze, the more and the more that he strove to pierce the profundity. But the lovely aromas in that enchanted air did at last seem to dispel, for a moment, the cankerous thing in his soul. That glad, happy air, that winsome sky, did at last stroke and caress him. The step–mother world, so long cruel, forbidding, now threw affectionate arms round his stubborn neck, and did seem to joyously sob over him, as if over one that however wilful and erring, she could yet find it in her heart to save and to bless. From beneath his slouched hat Ahab dropped a tear into the sea. Nor did all the Pacific contain such wealth as that one wee drop. Starbuck saw the old man; saw him, how he heavily leaned over the side; and he seemed to hear in his own true heart the measureless sobbing that stole out of the centre of the serenity around. Careful not to touch him, or be noticed by him, he yet drew near to him, and stood there. Ahab turned. "Starbuck." "Sir." "Oh, Starbuck! It is a mild, mild wind, and a mild–looking sky. On such a day, very much such a sweetness as this, I struck my first whale, a boy harpooneer of 18. 40 years ago. 40 years of continual whaling, 40 years of privation and peril and storm time, 40 years on the pitiless sea. For 40 years has Ahab forsaken the peaceful land, for 40 years to make war on the horrors of the deep. Aye, and yes, Starbuck, out of those 40 years I have not spent 3 ashore. When I think of this life I have led, the desolation of solitude it has been, the masoned, walled town of a captain's exclusiveness, which admits but small entrance to any sympathy from the green country without. Oh, weariness, heaviness, Guinea coast slavery of solitary command. When I think of all this, only half suspected, not so keenly known to me before, and how for 40 years I have fed upon dry salted fare, fit emblem of the dry nourishment of my soul, when the poorest landsman has had fresh fruit to his daily hand, and broken the world's fresh bread to my mouldy crusts. Away, whole oceans away from that young girl wife I wedded past 50, and sailed for Cape Horn the next day, leaving but one dent in my marriage pillow. Wife, rather a widow with her husband alive. Aye, I widowed that poor girl when I married her, Starbuck. And then the madness, the frenzy, the boiling blood, and the smoking brow with which, for 1,000 lowerings, old Ahab has furiously, foamingly chased his prey. More a demon than a man. Aye, aye, what a 40 years fool. Fool. Old fool has old Ahab been. Why this strife of the chase? Why weary and palsy the arm at the oar, and the iron, and the lance? How the richer or better is Ahab now? Behold! Oh, Starbuck, is it not hard, that with this weary load I bear, one poor leg should have been snatched from under me? Here, brush this old hair aside; it blinds me that I seem to weep. Locks so grey did never grow, but from out some ashes. But do I look very old, so very old, Starbuck? I feel deadly faint, bowed and humped, as though I were Adam staggering beneath the piled centuries since Paradise. God, 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 crack my heart, stave my brain. Mockery, mockery, bitter, biting mockery of grey hairs. Have I lived enough joy to wear ye, and seem and feel thus intolerably old? Close, stand close to me, Starbuck. Let me look into a human eye. It is better than to gaze into sea or sky, better than to gaze upon God. By the green land, by the bright hearthstone, this is the magic glass, man. I see my wife and my child in thine eye. No, no, stay on board, on board. Lower not when I do, when branded Ahab gives chase to Moby Dick. That hazard shall not be thine. No, no, not with the far away home I see in that eye. Oh, my captain, noble soul, grand old heart after all! Why should any one give chase to that hated fish? Away with me! Let us fly these deadly waters. Let us home. Wife and child, too, are Starbuck's; wife and child of his brotherly, sisterly, playfellow youth, even as thine, sir, are the wife and child of thy loving, longing, paternal old age. Away! Let us away! This instant let me alter the course. How cheerily, how hilariously, oh my captain, would we bowl our way to see old Nantucket again! I think, sir, they have some such mild blue days, even as this in Nantucket. They have, they have. I have seen them. Some summer days in the morning. About this time. Yes, it is his noon nap now. The boy vivaciously wakes, sits up in bed, and his mother tells him of me, of cannibal old me, how I am abroad upon the deep, but will yet come back to dance him again. 'Tis my Mary herself. She promised that my boy every morning should be carried to the hill, to catch the first glimpse of his father's sail. Yes, yes, no more; it is done; we head for Nantucket. Come, my captain, study out the course, and let us away. See, see, the boy's face from the window, the boy's hand on the hill. But Ahab's glance was averted. Like a blighted fruit tree he shook, and cast his last cindered apple to the soil. What is it? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening, hidden lord and master, and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me, that against all natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what in my own proper, natural heart I durst not so much as dare? Is Ahab? Is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm? But if the great sun move not of himself, but is as an errand boy in the heaven, nor one single star can revolve but by some invisible power. Then how can this one small heart beat, this one small brain think thoughts, unless God does that beating, does that thinking, does that living, and not I? By heaven, man, we are turned round and round in this world, like yonder windlass, and fate is the handspike. And all the time, lo, that smiling sky and this unsounded sea. Look, see yon albacore? Who put it into him to chase and fang that flying fish? Where do murderers go, man? Who's to doom when the judge himself is dragged to the bar? But it is a mild, mild wind, and a mild looking sky, and the air smells now as if it blew from a far away meadow. They have been making hay somewhere under the slopes of the Andes, Starbuck, and the mowers are sleeping among the new mown hay. Sleeping! Aye, toil we how we may, we all sleep at last on the field. Sleep, aye, and rust amid greenness, as last year's scythes flung down, and left in the half-cut swaths. Starbuck! But blanched to a corpse's hue with despair, the mate had stolen away. Ahab crossed the deck to gaze over on the other side, but started at two reflected, fixed eyes in the water there. Fedallah was motionlessly leaning over the same rail. End of chapters 128 to 132. Chapter 133. The Chase. First Day. That night in the mid-watch, when the old man, as his wont at intervals, stepped forth from the scuttle in which he leaned, and went to his pivot-hole, he suddenly thrust his face out fiercely, snuffing up the sea air as a sagacious ship's dog will, in drawing nigh to some barbarous isle. He declared that a whale must be near. Soon that peculiar odor, sometimes to a great distance given forth by the living sperm whale, was palpable to all the watch. Nor was any mariner surprised when, after inspecting the compass, and then the dog vane, and then ascertaining the precise bearing of the odor as nearly as possible, Ahab rapidly ordered the ship's course to be slightly altered, and the sail to be shortened. The acute policy dictating these movements was sufficiently vindicated at daybreak by the sight of a long sleek on the sea directly and lengthwise ahead, smooth as oil, and resembling in the pleated watery wrinkles bordering it, the polished metallic-like marks of some swift tide-rip at the mouth of a deep rapid stream. "Man the mastheads! Call all hands!" Thundering with the butts of 3 clubbed handspikes on the forecastle deck, Daggoo roused the sleepers with such judgment claps that they seemed to exhale from the scuttle, so instantaneously did they appear with their clothes in their hands. "What do ye see?" cried Ahab, flattening his face to the sky. "Nothing, nothing, sir," was the sound hailing down in reply. "T'gallant sails, stunsails, alow and aloft, and on both sides." All sail being set, he now cast loose the life-line reserved for swaying him to the main royal masthead, and in a few moments they were hoisting him thither, when while but 2/3 of the way aloft, and while peering ahead through the horizontal vacancy between the main topsail and the t'gallant sail, he raised a gull-like cry in the air. "There she blows! There she blows! A hump like a snow hill! It is Moby Dick!" Fired by the cry, which seemed simultaneously taken up by the 3 lookouts, the men on deck rushed to the rigging to behold the famous whale they had so long been pursuing. Ahab had now gained his final perch, some feet above the other lookouts, Tashtego standing just beneath him on the cap of the t'gallant mast, so that the Indian's head was almost on a level with Ahab's heel. From this height the whale was now seen some mile or so ahead, at every roll of the sea revealing his high sparkling hump, and regularly jetting his silent spout into the air.
To the credulous mariners it seemed the same silent spout they had so long ago beheld in the moonlit Atlantic and Indian Oceans. "And did none of ye see it before?" cried Ahab, hailing the perched men all around him. "I saw him almost that same instant, sir, that Captain Ahab did, and I cried out," said Tashtego. "Not the same instant, not the same. No, the doubloon is mine. Fate reserved the doubloon for me. I only. None of ye could have raised the white whale first. There she blows! There she blows! There she blows! There again! There again!" he cried out in long-drawn, lingering, methodic tones, attuned to the gradual prolongings of the whale's visible jets. "He's going to sound! In stunsails! Down t'gallant sails! Stand by 3 boats! Mr. Starbuck, remember, stay on board and keep the ship. Helm there! Luff, luff a point! So, steady, man, steady! There go flukes! No, no, only black water! Already the boats there! Stand by! Stand by! Lower me, Mr. Starbuck! Lower, lower! Quick! Quicker!" And he slid through the air to the deck. "He's heading straight to leeward, sir," cried Stubb. "Right away from us. Cannot have seen the ship yet." "Be dumb, man. Stand by the braces. Hard down the helm. Brace up. Shiver her, shiver her. So, well that. Boats, boats!" Soon all the boats but Starbuck's were dropped, all the boat sails set, all the paddles plying, with rippling swiftness shooting to leeward, and Ahab heading the onset. A pale death glimmer lit up Fedallah's sunken eyes, a hideous motion gnawed his mouth. Like noiseless nautilus shells, their light prows sped through the sea, but only slowly they neared the foe. As they neared him, the ocean grew still more smooth, seemed drawing a carpet over its waves, seemed a noon meadow, so serenely it spread. At length the breathless hunter came so nigh his seemingly unsuspecting prey, that his entire dazzling hump was distinctly visible, sliding along the sea as if an isolated thing, and continually set in a revolving ring of finest, fleecy, greenish foam. He saw the vast involved wrinkles of the slightly projecting head beyond. Before it, far out on the soft, Turkish rugged waters, went the glistening white shadow from his broad, milky forehead, a musical rippling playfully accompanying the shade; and behind, the blue waters interchangeably flowed over into the moving valley of his steady wake, and on either hand bright bubbles arose and danced by his side. But these were broken again by the light toes of hundreds of gay fowl softly feathering the sea, alternate with their fitful flight; and like to some flag staff rising from the painted hull of an argosy, the tall but shattered pole of a recent lance projected from the white whale's back, and at intervals one of the cloud of soft-toed fowls hovering, and to and fro skimming like a canopy over the fish, silently perched and rocked on this pole, the long tail feathers streaming like pennons. A gentle joyousness, a mighty mildness of repose and swiftness invested the gliding whale. Not the white bull Jupiter swimming away with ravished Europa clinging to his graceful horns; his lovely leering eyes sideways intent upon the maid, with smooth bewitching fleetness rippling straight for the nuptial bower in Crete; not Jove, not that great majesty supreme, did surpass the glorified whale as he so divinely swam. On each soft side, coincident with the parted swell, that but once leaving him then flowed so wide away; on each bright side the whale shed off enticings. No wonder there had been some among the hunters who, namelessly transported and allured by all this serenity, had ventured to assail it, but had fatally found that quietude but the vesture of tornadoes. Yet calm, enticing calm, O whale, thou glidest on to all who for the first time eye thee, no matter how many in that same way thou mayest have bejuggled and destroyed before. And thus, through the serene tranquillities of the tropical sea, Among waves whose hand clappings were suspended by exceeding rapture, Moby Dick moved on, still withholding from sight the full terrors of his submerged trunk, entirely hiding the wrenched hideousness of his jaw. But soon the fore part of him slowly rose from the water. For an instant his whole marbleized body formed a high arch, like Virginia's natural bridge; and warningly waving his bannered flukes in the air, the grand god revealed himself, sounded, and went out of sight. Hoveringly halting and dipping on the wing, the white sea fowls longingly lingered over the agitated pool that he left. With oars apeak and paddles down, the sheets of their sails adrift, the three boats now stilly floated, awaiting Moby Dick's reappearance. "An hour," said Ahab, standing rooted in his boat's stern; and he gazed beyond the whale's place, towards the dim blue spaces and wide wooing vacancies to leeward. It was only an instant, for again his eyes seemed whirling round in his head as he swept the watery circle. The breeze now freshened, the sea began to swell. "The birds! the birds!" cried Tashtego. In long Indian file, as when herons take wing, the white birds were now all flying towards Ahab's boat; and when within a few yards, began fluttering over the water there, wheeling round and round, with joyous expectant cries. Their vision was keener than man's. Ahab could discover no sign in the sea. But suddenly, as he peered down and down into its depths, he profoundly saw a white living spot, no bigger than a white weasel, with wonderful celerity uprising, and magnifying as it rose, till it turned, and then there were plainly revealed two long crooked rows of white glistening teeth, floating up from the undiscoverable bottom. It was Moby Dick's open mouth and scrolled jaw, his vast shadowed bulk still half blending with the blue of the sea. The glittering mouth yawned beneath the boat like an open doored marble tomb; and giving one sidelong sweep with his steering oar, Ahab whirled the craft aside from this tremendous apparition. Then calling upon Fedallah to change places with him, went forward to the bows, and seizing Perth's harpoon, commanded his crew to grasp their oars and stand by to stern. Now, by reason of this timely spinning round the boat upon its axis, its bow by anticipation was made to face the whale's head while yet under water. But as if perceiving this stratagem, Moby Dick, with that malicious intelligence ascribed to him, sidlingly transplanted himself, as it were, in an instant, shooting his pleated head lengthwise beneath the boat. Through and through every plank and each rib, it thrilled for an instant, the whale obliquely lying on his back, in the manner of a biting shark, slowly and feelingly taking its bows full within his mouth, so that the long, narrow, scrolled lower jaw curled high up into the open air, and one of the teeth caught in a rowlock. The bluish pearl white of the inside of the jaw was within 6 inches of Ahab's head, and reached higher than that. In this attitude the white whale now shook the slight cedar as a mildly cruel cat her mouse. With unastonished eyes Fedallah gazed and crossed his arms, but the tiger yellow crew were tumbling over each other's heads to gain the uttermost stern. And now, while both elastic gunwales were springing in and out, while the whale dallied with the doomed craft in this devilish way, and from his body being submerged beneath the boat, he could not be darted at from the bows, for the bows were almost inside of him, as it were; and while the other boats involuntarily paused as before a quick crisis impossible to withstand, then it was that monomaniac Ahab, furious with this tantalizing vicinity of his foe, which placed him all alive and helpless in the very jaws he hated, frenzied with all this, he seized the long bone with his naked hands, and wildly strove to wrench it from its grip. As now he thus vainly strove, the jaw slipped from him, the frail gunwales bent in, collapsed, and snapped, as both jaws, like an enormous shears, sliding further aft, bit the craft completely in twain, and locked themselves fast again in the sea, midway between the two floating wrecks. These floated aside, the broken ends drooping, the crew at the stern wreck clinging to the gunwales, and striving to hold fast to the oars to lash them across. At that preluding moment, ere the boat was yet snapped, Ahab, the first to perceive the whale's intent by the crafty upraising of his head, a movement that loosed his hold for the time, at that moment his hand made one final effort to push the boat out of the bight, but only slipping further into the whale's mouth, and tilting over sideways as it slipped, the boat had shaken off his hold on the jaw, spilled him out of it, as he leaned to the push, and so he fell flat-faced upon the sea. Ripplingly withdrawing from his prey, Moby Dick now lay at a little distance, vertically thrusting his oblong white head up and down in the billows, and at the same time slowly revolving his whole spindled body, so that when his vast wrinkled forehead rose, some 20 or more feet out of the water, the now rising swells, with all their confluent waves, dazzlingly broke against it, vindictively tossing their shivered spray still higher in the air. So in a gale, the but half baffled Channel billows only recoil from the base of the Eddystone, triumphantly to overleap its summit with their scud. Footnote: This motion is peculiar to the sperm whale. It receives its designation, pitch-poling, from its being likened to that preliminary up and down poise of the whale lance in the exercise called pitch-poling previously described. By this motion the whale must best and most comprehensively view whatever objects may be encircling him. End of footnote. But soon resuming his horizontal attitude, Moby Dick swam swiftly round and round the wrecked crew, sideways churning the water in his vengeful wake, as if lashing himself up to still another and more deadly assault. The sight of the splintered boat seemed to madden him, as the blood of grapes and mulberries cast before Antiochus's elephants in the book of Maccabees. Meanwhile Ahab, half smothered in the foam of the whale's insolent tail, and too much of a cripple to swim, though he could still keep afloat even in the heart of such a whirlpool as that, helpless Ahab's head was seen, like a tossed bubble which the least chance shock might burst. From the boat's fragmentary stern, Fedallah incuriously and mildly eyed him; the clinging crew at the other drifting end could not succor him; more than enough was it for them to look to themselves. For so revolvingly appalling was the white whale's aspect, and so planetarily swift the ever contracting circles he made, that he seemed horizontally swooping upon them. And though the other boats, unharmed, still hovered hard by, still they dared not pull into the eddy to strike, lest that should be the signal for the instant destruction of the jeopardized castaways, Ahab and all; nor, in that case, could they themselves hope to escape. With straining eyes, then, they remained on the outer edge of the direful zone, whose centre had now become the old man's head. Meantime, from the beginning, all this had been descried from the ship's mastheads, and squaring her yards, she had borne down upon the scene, and was now so nigh that Ahab in the water hailed her. "Sail on the—" But that moment a breaking sea dashed on him from Moby Dick, and whelmed him for the time. But struggling out of it again, and chancing to rise on the towering crest, he shouted, "Sail on the whale! Drive him off!" The Pequod's prows were pointed, and breaking up the charmed circle, she effectually parted the white whale from his victim. As he sullenly swam off, the boats flew to the rescue. Dragged into Stubb's boat with bloodshot blinded eyes, the white brine caking in his wrinkles, the long tension of Ahab's bodily strength did crack, and helplessly he yielded to his body's doom, for a time lying all crushed in the bottom of Stubb's boat, like one trodden under foot of herds of elephants. Far inland nameless wails came from him, as desolate sounds from out ravines. But this intensity of his physical prostration did but so much the more abbreviate it. In an instant's compass, great hearts sometimes condense to one deep pang the sum total of those shallow pains kindly diffused through feebler men's whole lives; and so such hearts, though summary in each one suffering, still, if the gods decree it, in their lifetime aggregate a whole age of woe, wholly made up of instantaneous intensities. For even in their pointless centres, those noble natures contain the entire circumferences of inferior souls. "The harpoon," said Ahab, halfway rising, and draggingly leaning on one bended arm. "Is it safe?" "Aye, sir, for it was not darted. This is it," said Stubb, showing it. "Lay it before me. Any missing men?" "1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 5 oars, sir, and here are 5 men." "That's good. Help me, man. I wish to stand. So, so, I see him. There, there. Going to leeward still. What a leaping spout. Hands off from me. The eternal sap runs up in Ahab's bones again. Set the sail. Out oars. The helm." It is often the case that when a boat is stove, its crew being picked up by another boat, help to work that second boat, and the chase is thus continued with what is called double banked oars. It was thus now. But the added power of the boat did not equal the added power of the whale, for he seemed to have treble banked his every fin, swimming with a velocity which plainly showed that if now under these circumstances pushed on, the chase would prove an indefinitely prolonged if not a hopeless one; nor could any crew endure for so long a period such an unintermitted, intense straining at the oar, a thing barely tolerable only in some one brief vicissitude. The ship itself then, as it sometimes happens, offered the most promising intermediate means of overtaking the chase. Accordingly, the boats now made for her, and were soon swayed up to their cranes, the 2 parts of the wrecked boat having been previously secured by her; and then hoisting everything to her side, and stacking her canvas high up, and sideways outstretching it with stunsails, like the double jointed wings of an albatross, the Pequod bore down in the leeward wake of Moby Dick. At the well known methodic intervals, the whale's glittering spout was regularly announced from the manned mast heads; and when he would be reported as just gone down, Ahab would take the time, and then pacing the deck, binnacle watch in hand, so soon as the last second of the allotted hour expired, his voice was heard. "Whose is the doubloon now? D'ye see him?" And if the reply was "No, sir," straightway he commanded them to lift him to his perch. In this way the day wore on; Ahab now aloft and motionless, anon unrestingly pacing the planks. As he was thus walking, uttering no sound except to hail the men aloft, or to bid them hoist a sail still higher, or to spread one to a still greater breadth; thus to and fro pacing beneath his slouched hat, at every turn he passed his own wrecked boat, which had been dropped upon the quarter deck, and lay there reversed, broken bow to shattered stern. At last he paused before it, and as in an already overclouded sky fresh troops of clouds will sometimes sail across, so over the old man's face there now stole some such added gloom as this. Stubb saw him pause, and perhaps intending, not vainly though, to evince his own unabated fortitude, and thus keep up a valiant place in his captain's mind, he advanced, and eyeing the wreck, exclaimed, "The thistle the ass refused; it pricked his mouth too keenly, sir, ha, ha!" "What soulless thing is this that laughs before a wreck? Man, man! Did I not know thee brave as fearless fire, and as mechanical, I could swear thou wert a poltroon. Groan nor laugh should be heard before a wreck." "Aye, aye, sir," said Starbuck, drawing near. "'Tis a solemn sight; an omen and an ill one." "Omen, omen! The dictionary! If the gods think to speak outright to man, they will honorably speak outright, not shake their heads and give an old wives' darkling hint. Begone! Ye two are the opposite poles of one thing. Starbuck is Stubb reversed, and Stubb is Starbuck. And ye two are all mankind. And Ahab stands alone among the millions of the peopled earth, nor gods nor men his neighbors. Cold, cold, I shiver. How now? Aloft there! D'ye see him? Sing out for every spout, though he spout 10 times a second.
The day was nearly done; only the hem of his golden robe was rustling. Soon it was almost dark, but the look out men still remained unset.
"Can't see the spout now, sir; too dark," cried a voice from the air. "How heading when last seen?" "As before, sir; straight to leeward." "Good; he will travel slower, now 'tis night. Down royals and t'gallant stunsails, Mr. Starbuck; we must not run over him before morning. He's making a passage now, and may heave to awhile. Helm there! Keep her full before the wind. Aloft, come down! Mr. Stubb, send a fresh hand to the foremast head, and see it manned till morning."
Then advancing toward the doubloon in the mainmast,
"Men, this gold is mine, for I earned it; but I shall let it abide here till the white whale is dead; and then whosoever of ye first raises him, upon the day he shall be killed, this gold is that man's; and if on that day I shall again raise him, then 10 times its sum shall be divided among all of ye. Away now! The deck is thine, sir."
and so saying, he placed himself half way within the scuttle, and slouching his hat, stood there till dawn, except when at intervals rousing himself to see how the night wore on. CHAPTER 134. The Chase, Second Day. At daybreak the 3 mastheads were punctually manned afresh.
"D'ye see him?"
cried Ahab, after allowing a little space for the light to spread.
"See nothing, sir." "Turn up all hands and make sail. He travels faster than I thought for. The t'gallant sails! Aye, they should have been kept on her all night. But no matter, 'tis but resting for the rush."
Here be it said that this pertinacious pursuit of one particular whale, continued through day into night, and through night into day, is a thing by no means unprecedented in the South Sea fishery. For such is the wonderful skill, prescience of experience, and invincible confidence acquired by some great natural geniuses among the Nantucket commanders, that from the simple observation of a whale when last described, they will, under certain given circumstances, pretty accurately foretell both the direction in which he will continue to swim for a time while out of sight, as well as his probable rate of progression during that period. And in these cases, somewhat as a pilot when about losing sight of the coast, whose general trending he well knows, and which he desires shortly to return to again, but at some further point; like as this pilot stands by his compass, and takes the precise bearing of the cape at present visible, in order the more certainly to hit aright the remote unseen headland eventually to be visited; so does the fisherman at his compass with the whale. For after being chased and diligently marked through several hours of daylight, then when night obscures the fish, the creature's future wake through the darkness is almost as established to the sagacious mind of the hunter as the pilot's coast is to him. So that to this hunter's wondrous skill, the proverbial evanescence of a thing writ in water, a wake, is to all desired purposes well nigh as reliable as the steadfast land. And as the mighty iron leviathan of the modern railway is so familiarly known in its every pace, that with watches in their hands men time his rate as doctors that of a baby's pulse, and lightly say of it, the up train or the down train will reach such and such a spot at such and such an hour; even so almost there are occasions when these Nantucketers time that other leviathan of the deep, according to the observed humor of his speed, and say to themselves, so many hours hence, this whale will have gone 200 miles, will have about reached this or that degree of latitude or longitude. But to render this acuteness at all successful in the end, the wind and the sea must be the whaleman's allies. For of what present avail to the becalmed or wind‐bound mariner is the skill that assures him that he is exactly 93 leagues and a quarter from his port? Inferable from these statements are many collateral subtle matters touching the chase of whales.
The ship tore on, leaving such a furrow in the sea as when a cannon ball, missent, becomes a ploughshare and turns up the level field. "By salt and hemp!" cried Stubb, "but this swift motion of the deck creeps up one's legs and tingles at the heart. This ship and I are two brave fellows, ha, ha! Some one take me up and launch me spinewise on the sea; for, by live oaks, my spine's a keel. Ha, ha! We go the gait that leaves no dust behind." "There she blows! she blows! she blows right ahead!" was now the mast head cry. "Aye, aye!" cried Stubb, "I knew it. Ye can't escape. Blow on and split your spout, O whale! The mad fiend himself is after ye. Blow your trump, blister your lungs. Ahab will dam off your blood, as a miller shuts his water gate upon the stream." And Stubb did but speak out for well nigh all the crew. The frenzies of the chase had by this time worked them bubblingly up, like old wine worked anew. Whatever pale fears and forebodings some of them might have felt before, these were not only now kept out of sight through the growing awe of Ahab, but they were broken up, and on all sides routed, as timid prairie hares that scatter before the bounding bison. The hand of fate had snatched all their souls, and by the stirring perils of the previous day, the rack of the past night's suspense, the fixed, unfearing, blind, reckless way in which their wild craft went plunging toward its flying mark, by all these things their hearts were bowled along. The wind that made great bellies of their sails, and rushed the vessel on by arms invisible as irresistible, this seemed the symbol of that unseen agency which so enslaved them to the race. They were one man, not 30; for, as the one ship that held them all, though it was put together of all contrasting things, oak and maple and pine wood, iron and pitch and hemp, yet all these ran into each other into the one concrete hull, which shot on its way, both balanced and directed by the long central keel. Even so all the individualities of the crew, this man's valor, that man's fear, guilt and guiltiness, all varieties were welded into oneness, and were all directed to that fatal goal which Ahab, their one lord and keel, did point to. The rigging lived. The mastheads, like the tops of tall palms, were outspreadingly tufted with arms and legs. Clinging to a spar with one hand, some reached forth the other with impatient wavings; others, shading their eyes from the vivid sunlight, sat far out on the rocking yards; all the spars in full bearing of mortals ready and ripe for their fate. Ah, how they still strove through that infinite blueness to seek out the thing that might destroy them. "Why sing ye not out for him, if ye see him?" cried Ahab, when, after the lapse of some minutes since the first cry, no more had been heard. "Sway me up, men! Ye have been deceived. Not Moby Dick casts one odd jet that way, and then disappears." It was even so. In their headlong eagerness, the men had mistaken some other thing for the whale spout, as the event itself soon proved. For hardly had Ahab reached his perch, hardly was the rope belayed to its pin on the deck, when he struck the key note to an orchestra that made the air vibrate as with the combined discharges of rifles. The triumphant halloo of 30 buckskin lungs was heard, as, much nearer to the ship than the place of the imaginary jet, Moby Dick bodily burst into view. For not by any calm or indolent spoutings, not by the peaceable gush of that mystic fountain in his head, did the white whale now reveal his vicinity, but by the far more wondrous phenomenon of breaching. Rising with his utmost velocity from the furthest depths, the sperm whale thus booms his entire bulk into the pure element of air, and piling up a mountain of dazzling foam, shows his place to the distance of 7 miles or more. In those moments, the torn, enraged waves he shakes off seem his mane. In some cases, this breaching is his act of defiance. "There she breaches! There she breaches!" was the cry, as in his immeasurable bravadoes the white whale tossed himself salmon like to heaven. so suddenly seen in the blue plain of the sea, and relieved against the still bluer margin of the sky, the spray that he raised for the moment intolerably glittered and glared like a glacier, and stood there gradually fading and fading away from its first sparkling intensity to the dim mistiness of an advancing shower in a vale. "Aye, breach your last to the sun, Moby Dick," cried Ahab. "Thy hour and thy harpoon are at hand. Down, down, all of ye, but one man at the fore. The boats, stand by!" Unmindful of the tedious rope ladders of the shrouds, the men, like shooting stars, slid to the deck, by the isolated backstays and halyards, while Ahab, less dartingly, but still rapidly, was dropped from his perch. "Lower away!" he cried, so soon as he had reached his boat, a spare one rigged the afternoon previous. "Mr. Starbuck, the ship is thine. Keep away from the boats, but keep near them. Lower all!" As if to strike a quick terror into them by this time being the first assailant himself, Moby Dick had turned, and was now coming for the three crews. Ahab's boat was central, and cheering his men, he told them he would take the whale head and head; that is, pull straight up to his forehead, a not uncommon thing, for when within a certain limit such a course excludes the coming onset from the whale's sidelong vision. But ere that close limit was gained, and while yet all three boats were plain as the ship's three masts to his eye, the white whale churning himself into furious speed, almost in an instant as it were, rushing among the boats with open jaws and a lashing tail, offered appalling battle on every side, and heedless of the irons darted at him from every boat, seemed only intent on annihilating each separate plank of which those boats were made. But skillfully maneuvered, incessantly wheeling like trained chargers in the field, the boats for a while eluded him, though at times but by a plank's breadth, while all the time Ahab's unearthly slogan tore every other cry but his to shreds. But at last, in his untraceable evolutions, the white whale so crossed and recrossed, and in 1,000 ways entangled the slack of the three lines now fast to him, that they foreshortened, and of themselves warped the devoted boats towards the planted irons in him; though now for a moment the whale drew aside a little, as if to rally for a more tremendous charge. Seizing that opportunity, Ahab first paid out more line, and then was rapidly hauling and jerking in upon it again, hoping that way to disencumber it of some snarls, when lo! a sight more savage than the embattled teeth of sharks. Caught and twisted, corkscrewed in the mazes of the line, loose harpoons and lances, with all their bristling barbs and points, came flashing and dripping up to the chocks in the bows of Ahab's boat. Only one thing could be done. Seizing the boat knife, he critically reached within, through, and then without the rays of steel, dragged in the line beyond, passed it inboard to the bowsman, and then twice sundering the rope near the chocks, dropped the intercepted faggot of steel into the sea, and was all fast again. That instant, the white whale made a sudden rush among the remaining tangles of the other lines; by so doing irresistibly dragged the more involved boats of Stubb and Flask toward his flukes, dashed them together like two rolling husks on a surf-beaten beach, and then diving down into the sea, disappeared in a boiling maelstrom, in which, for a space, the odorous cedar chips of the wrecks danced round and round, like the grated nutmeg in a swiftly stirred bowl of punch. While the two crews were yet circling in the waters, reaching out after the revolving line tubs, oars, and other floating furniture; while a slope little Flask bobbed up and down like an empty vial, twitching his legs upwards to escape the dreaded jaws of sharks; and Stubb was lustily singing out for some one to ladle him up; and while the old man's line, now parting, admitted of his pulling into the creamy pool to rescue whom he could; in that wild simultaneousness of 1,000 concreted perils, Ahab's yet unstricken boat seemed drawn up towards heaven by invisible wires, as arrow like, shooting perpendicularly from the sea, the white whale dashed his broad forehead against its bottom, and sent it turning over and over into the air, till it fell again, gunwale downwards, and Ahab and his men struggled from out under it like seals from a seaside cave. The first uprising momentum of the whale, modifying its direction as he struck the surface, involuntarily launched him along it to a little distance from the centre of the destruction he had made; and with his back to it, he now lay for a moment slowly feeling with his flukes from side to side; and whenever a stray oar, bit of plank, the least chip or crumb of the boats touched his skin, his tail swiftly drew back, and came sideways smiting the sea. But soon, as if satisfied that his work for that time was done, he pushed his pleated forehead through the ocean, and trailing after him the intertangled lines, continued his leeward way at a traveller's methodic pace. As before, the attentive ship having descried the whole fight, again came bearing down to the rescue, and dropping a boat, picked up the floating mariners, tubs, oars, and whatever else could be caught at, and safely landed them on her decks. Some sprained shoulders, wrists, ankles, livid contusions, wrenched harpoons and lances, inextricable intricacies of rope, shattered oars and planks, all these were there, but no fatal or even serious ill seemed to have befallen any one. As with Fedallah the day before, so Ahab was now found grimly clinging to his boat's broken half, which afforded a comparatively easy float; nor did it so exhaust him as the previous day's mishap. But when he was helped to the deck, all eyes were fastened upon him, as instead of standing by himself, he still half hung upon the shoulder of Starbuck, who had thus far been the foremost to assist him. His ivory leg had been snapped off, leaving but one short, sharp splinter. "Aye, aye, Starbuck, 'tis sweet to lean sometimes, be the leaner who he will; and would old Ahab had leaned oftener than he has." "The ferrule has not stood, sir," said the carpenter, now coming up. "I put good work into that leg." "But no bones broken, sir, I hope," said Stubb, with true concern. "Aye, and all splintered to pieces, Stubb; d'ye see it? But even with a broken bone, old Ahab is untouched; and I account no living bone of mine one jot more me than this dead one that's lost. Nor white whale, nor man, nor fiend can so much as graze old Ahab in his own proper and inaccessible being. Can any lead touch yonder floor, any mast scrape yonder roof? Aloft there! Which way?" "Dead to leeward, sir." "Up helm, then! Pile on the sail again, ship keepers! Down the rest of the spare boats, and rig them! Mr. Starbuck, away, and muster the boats' crews."
"Let me first help thee towards the bulwarks, sir."
"Oh, oh, oh, how this splinter gores me now! Accursed fate, that the unconquerable captain in the soul should have such a craven mate. Sir! My body, man, not thee. Give me something for a cane. There, that shivered lance will do. Muster the men. Surely I have not seen him yet. By heaven, it cannot be. Missing? Quick, call them all."
The old man's hinted thought was true. Upon mustering the company, the Parsee was not there.
"The Parsee!" cried Stubb. "He must have been caught in—" "The black vomit wrench thee! Run, all of ye, above, alow, cabin, forecastle! Find him! Not gone! Not gone!"
But quickly they returned to him with the tidings that the Parsee was nowhere to be found. "Aye, sir," said Stubb, "caught among the tangles of your line. I thought I saw him dragging under."
"My line! My line! Gone! Gone! What means that little word? What death knell rings in it, that old Ahab shakes as if he were the belfry? The harpoon, too! Toss over the litter there. D'ye see it? The forged iron, men, the white whales! No, no, no! Blistered fool! This hand did dart it; 'tis in the fish! Aloft there! Keep him nailed! Quick! All hands to the rigging of the boats! Collect the oars! Harpooneers, the irons, the irons! Hoist the royals higher! A pull on all the sheets! Helm there, steady, steady for your life! I'll 10 times girdle the unmeasured globe, yea, and drive straight through it, but I'll slay him yet!"
"Great God! but for one single instant show thyself," cried Starbuck. "Never, never wilt thou capture him, old man. In Jesus' name, no more of this; that's worse than devil's madness. 2 days' chase, twice stove to splinters, thy very leg once more snatched from under thee, thy evil shadow gone, all good angels mobbing thee with warnings. What more wouldst thou have? Shall we keep chasing this murderous fish till he swamps the last man? Shall we be dragged by him to the bottom of the sea? Shall we be towed by him to the infernal world? Oh, oh, impiety and blasphemy to hunt him more!"
"Starbuck, of late I've felt strangely moved to thee. Ever since that hour we both saw, thou know'st what, in each other's eyes. But in this matter of the whale, be the front of thy face to me as the palm of this hand, a lipless, unfeatured blank. Ahab is for ever Ahab, man. This whole act's immutably decreed. 'Twas rehearsed by thee and me a billion years before this ocean rolled. Fool! I am the Fates' lieutenant. I act under orders. Look thou, underling, that thou obeyest mine. Stand round me, men. You see an old man cut down to the stump, leaning on a shivered lance, propped up on a lonely foot. 'Tis Ahab, his body's part. But Ahab's soul's a centipede that moves upon 100 legs. I feel strained, half stranded, as ropes that tow dismasted frigates in a gale. And I may look so. But ere I break, you'll hear me crack; and till ye hear that, know that Ahab's hawser tows his purpose yet. Believe ye, men, in the things called omens? Then laugh aloud and cry encore; for ere they drown, drowning things will twice rise to the surface, then rise again to sink for evermore. So with Moby Dick. 2 days he's floated; to‐morrow will be the 3rd. Aye, men, he'll rise once more, but only to spout his last. Do ye feel brave, men? Brave? As fearless fire, cried Stubb. And as mechanical, muttered Ahab.
Then, as the men went forward, he muttered on.
The things called omens. And yesterday I talked the same to Starbuck there concerning my broken boat. Oh, how valiantly I seek to drive out of others' hearts what's clinched so fast in mine. The Parsee gone, gone, and he was to go before, but still was to be seen again ere I could perish. How's that? There's a riddle now might baffle all the lawyers backed by the ghosts of the whole line of judges. Like a hawk's beak it pecks my brain. I'll solve it though.
When dusk descended, the whale was still in sight to leeward. So once more the sail was shortened, and everything passed nearly as on the previous night, only the sound of hammers and the hum of the grindstone was heard till nearly daylight, as the men toiled by lanterns in the complete and careful rigging of the spare boats, and sharpening their fresh weapons for the morrow. Meantime, of the broken keel of Ahab's wrecked craft, the carpenter made him another leg, while still as on the night before, slouched Ahab stood fixed within his scuttle, his hid heliotrope glance anticipatingly gone backward on its dial, sat due eastward for the earliest sun. Chapter 134.